Welcome to episode 7 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Grace Tiffany, novelist, author, and professor of English literature at Western Michigan University. Another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
And that raises the question. John Shakespeare, his father, as I said, became a very important authority in town of Stratford. But there is that question, under these militant circumstances, would the authorities have allowed him to become an important administrative figure in Stratford if he was Catholic? I think the answer is no.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Taking sides in the debate over the religion of William Shakespeare has been almost as hotly contested by Shakespeare scholars as the actual war between Catholic and Protestantism going on in England at the time. Famously, Queen Elizabeth ushered Protestantism into England when she beheaded her cousin Mary Stuart. With a social and political climate of such highly tense proportions, we have to believe that Shakespeare's plays were impacted by this religious war that was going on around him. But to help unpack the mystery from the fact and determine exactly to what degree Shakespeare's plays were impacted by what was going on in the climate of the monarchy and the religion of the day, we are talking this week with Dr. David Bevington. Called one of the most learned and devoted of Shakespeareans by Harold Bloom, Dr. David Bevington is an American literary scholar who specializes in British drama of the Renaissance and has edited and introduced the complete works of William Shakespeare in both the 29-volume Bantam Classics paperback editions and the single-volume Longman edition. Dr. Bevington remains the only living scholar to have personally edited Shakespeare's complete corpus. Interestingly, it was the Longman edition of Shakespeare that I actually used in college when I was studying Shakespeare. He'll be talking with us this week about religion in the 16th century. I'll be asking him to offer a brief explanation of the state of Catholic versus Protestant in England during Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as what, if any, impact this climate had on the life and work of William Shakespeare himself. Dr. Bevington, we are truly delighted to be speaking with you today. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
You and Shakespeare have covered a lot of ground together over the years, and I wondered what made you want to make a career out of studying Shakespeare instead of something else. How did you get where you are today?
I studied English literature and history in Harvard College I got a degree in 1952, then with the Navy for 3 years, because that was during the Korean War. When I came back to I was back into graduate school at Harvard, very pleased about. I was thinking of doing Victorian studies, but I ran into Professor Alfred Harvage, who was newly arrived from Penn and from Columbia. And he was offering a course in Renaissance plays, including Shakespeare, in terms of theatrical work. And it was designed for a rather limited number of graduate students. But there were about 12 of us and so on. And it was the one course of that year that really made terrific sense for me. It worked beautifully. And I got a topic that I really enjoyed, and I found some new stuff. And Harvage was very pleased with it. So it just took off right from there. I was just thrilled to be able to work with him. He was an ideal thesis director, and he liked my work, and I certainly admired him. So, and that was about staging of plays, basically, about staging Shakespeare and other Renaissance drama. But I got as my assignment Antony and Cleopatra, a play that I just adore. And so I was able to try to do a whole staging program about that play.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Well, what has been your biggest challenge with studying Shakespeare? What's the biggest obstacle that you face in your work?
Well, one thing is it's a little hard to find new topics because, I think even some years ago, there was one book about Shakespeare for every day in the year. I think it's gone up above that number now. So finding something original to work is a daunting challenge indeed. And that was basically how I got started, because I went over to the Weiner Library at Harvard and ran into some Renaissance plays, actually earlier on, middle 16th century, that were not very interesting plays, but they were English plays acted for small companies on tour. And they were what's called offered for acting. That is, they had indications on them that 6 may play this play at ease, or 6 or 8 or so on. And it noted how the parts were divided among the 6 players. Well, I thought, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard about this, and Harwich hadn't either. They was buried somewhere in Widener Library. I found this stuff. So I worked that out in terms of seeing this as a way in which a text of a play might be used a way like this to see how a play was actually written to be designed to be acted by actors. And I thought, that sounds like a wonderful topic, and I wonder if it'll work for like Marlowe and Shakespeare. And I wrote that up, and it turned out to be my dissertation topic. And I focused on Marlowe in that case, but it still was an entryway in. And another thing I might say at that point, I wrote that and got a degree. And then published a book out of it. So that was all a great success.
Yeah.
And it was also then a way of getting into, obviously, Shakespeare work. And then Harwich was at that point in charge of an edition for Penguin of a complete text of Shakespeare, an anthology of editions, and asking some of his colleagues there all around the country, people he knew. So it was quite a distinguished list of people who were editing the plays. But when he got down to some of the plays that don't get read very often, he apparently thought, well, maybe I should offer I don't want to bother my distinguished colleagues if they would have edit Henry VI Part 1. Why don't I ask this graduate student named Bevington? So he did, and of course I accepted with alacrity. And that turned out to be a very interesting assignment. And the next thing was very exciting about this was I got a job offer about that time from Virginia, University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And the chair there and the senior Shakespearean was Francis Bowers, a name known to all people in Shakespeare work as probably the top person in the country, maybe in the world, in terms of editing of Renaissance texts. And I thought, well, I can go to Charlottesville and learn about editing from Francis Bowers, because it wasn't taught much at Harvard. I didn't have any courses in this. The department regarded this as a waste of time, and so it just wasn't Harvard's thing. So I went off to Virginia and worked with Fred Bowers, and we hit it off again very well. And so that's how I got started editing. So I edited Henry VI Part 1 for this Penguin volume, and it did turn out to be an interesting play, actually. So.
Yeah, it was a great launching off point. Well,
Yes.
So that's some of your obstacles that you face. But what do you love most about what you do?
Well, then working on Shakespeare, I mean, it's a truism that Shakespeare is probably the most popular writer in history. And I hadn't known about all this. I got into it. I discovered that working over those plays was perfectly astonishing. So soon at Virginia, not right at first, but then there was a retirement course opened up in Shakespeare for undergraduates at the University of Virginia, and I jumped into that with glee. And so there was a whole year course, and I was able to teach all the big plays of Shakespeare anyway, and the course succeeded and the enrollments went up. And so it was just thrilling to be able to discover what it was to teach bright undergraduates and ones who would really like to know more about how the Shakespeare plays are fit together from the point of view of theater, but also thematic and historical background. There are so many different ways of. So I sort of cut my teeth in learning how to teach not just Shakespeare, but teach generally, and by tackling this I think it's true that he really is the best writer that the English language for has never had. It's just perfectly extraordinary. And a number of times he's quoted because he expresses things so well. I mean, among other things, he was truly a great poet, a great dramatist and a great poet. That's a pretty good combination.
It's an excellent combination. And
Right.
I do want to ask you about Shakespeare a little more personally. Specifically, do we know what religion Shakespeare adhered to privately?
Yes, I would love to talk about that. There's been quite a lot of controversy over the last 20 years or so as to whether Shakespeare might have been Catholic. Indeed, your questions that you're suggesting in that direction, that is indeed a viable question to talk about. I think there's a kind of a cadre of people who seem to have a vested interest in wanting to prove that he it's an interesting a priori, it's an interesting possibility because his father, John Shakespeare, was born before the English Reformation in the earlier part of the 16th century. He certainly grew up a Catholic when he was young, and seems to have, there was some questions whether he might have signed a document indicating his wish to return to the Catholic fold. I'm not so sure about that document. There are reasons to be skeptical about this. This is in Stratford, of course, where Shakespeare was born and lived.
Right.
Upon Avon. And John Shakespeare became what we would probably call the mayor of the town. He was the head administrative authority in the town, did so successfully. Well, by this time, Shakespeare was born in 1564, and the decades after that, England was very much under with the control of the new administration of Protestant Elizabeth I and her ministers, who were very involved, very militant campaign to defend England against Catholic Spain and especially other power in the continent, especially Catholic Spain. And this was after Elizabeth sold her sister, Queen Mary, in the middle of the 16th century, had tried to return England to Catholicism. So it was a hot and burning issue, and life and death depended upon it. And in fact, in 1588, the Great Spanish Armada was an attempt on the part of King Philip of Spain to invade England with the purpose of returning England to the Catholic fold. So in England, they were really Elizabeth's ministers were very busy making sure that this didn't happen, and that what the greater problem was that Elizabeth's cousin, Queen Mary Stuart of Scotland, was by this time in house arrest in England. She'd come over to England because she was kicked out by the Protestants out of Scotland. But she was, of course, a very dangerous person to have in England in house arrest and so on, because she was obviously a magnet for all the people in England that might be interested in returning the country to the Catholic faith and so on. But the chances are that they would be wanting to conspire with her. And that turned out to be true. There were conspiracies during the 1580s, especially about the time when the Spanish Armada was reportedly on its way. And of course, they all knew in England that Philip of Spain was doing this. He was building an armada of ships to invade England. And there was one of the conspiracies, the most prominent, was a so-called Bevington conspiracy. The gentleman with that name headed a group of people who were in secret touch with Queen Mary of Scotland. And Elizabeth was finally then having had to decide whether she would countenance the execution of her first cousin. She didn't want to do that because it was a first cousin, and she didn't like the idea of people executing their monarchs anyway. But finally that did happen. She was beheaded in the Tower in London, and then the Spanish Armada came and fizzled when they partly went to bad weather, but also the brilliance of the English naval officers, Sir Francis Drake and so on. So that was a triumph, that the attempt to invade England and return the country to Catholicism had failed. But in the midst of all that, there was a highly militant situation, and was Shakespeare during that time a member of a family who were perhaps secretly Catholic? Again, I would suggest that the reasons there are to be wondering about that with her father especially. There was also a number on her mother's side. There was another family of Arden. There was another Catholic family. In fact, there were quite a few Catholics in that part of England, up in around Stratford in Warwickshire. So
you've mentioned Mary and Elizabeth, and we do know that the leadership of England at the time was very torn, but it seemed, you mentioned the Protestants in Scotland even that were pushing Mary Stuart out. And I just wonder what actually was fueling this conflict. Why was there this massive turmoil between these two religions?
That's good. From our point of view today, it's apt to say, would people really been to kill each other or burn each other at the stake and so on over such a matter as to whether it should be the Catholic faith or the Protestant faith? That seems a little extreme.
It does. For today's standards, it does. So,
but these are the years of the wars of faith, and as far as Philip of Spain was concerned, it was worth spending a fortune. Of course, it's the money he'd gotten from sending people over into Central and South America, coming back with all that gold. That money was used then to build a huge fleet of ships to be able to invade. But of course, the Spanish were trying to invade the Netherlands during the same period. And Elizabeth then had the responsibility of whether she would come to the defense of the Netherlands. She did. One of her favorite ministers, the Earl of Leicester, to whom she seems to have had personal fondness also. She decided that she would send him over with military force to help the Spaniards invade the Spanish on the continent with some success. So it was a matter of life or death in terms of the leadership of the countries. I mean,
well, what was it like for William Shakespeare? I mean, was church attendance or even a particular religious affiliation regulated during this time period in England?
Yes, it was mandatory. Right. And that raises the question of John Shakespeare, his father, as I said, became a very important authority in the town of Stratford. But he also, there is that question under these militant circumstances, would the authorities have allowed him to become an important administrative figure in Stratford if he was Catholic? I think the answer is no. There's also important the fact that he did baptize his children.
That's true.
There's basically one church in Stratford. This is true of a lot of towns of that size, which is still there. It's called the Holy Trinity Church. And it had become, from being a Catholic church, it became a Protestant church during this period.
Which it had to do under Elizabeth to stay.
It had to,
open.
but then Shakespeare had his children baptized there. Of course, there was nowhere else to have his children baptized, but they were baptized in the Protestant faith, please. It was not in the Catholic faith. And then he himself is buried under the altar in Stratford. It's a wonderful place to visit, along with his wife and other members of the family. They're obviously by this time the first family because Shakespeare had by this time made a lot of money and he retired back there around 1610 when he was in his later years, in fact, near death. So, but he died there, and he himself, there's no indication at all that he attempted to become a Catholic.
A Catholic. Why do you think people wonder so much about whether he was Protestant or Catholic? Does it have a great impact on our understanding of Shakespeare to know?
We're still feeling somewhat embattled about the question of Catholic and Protestant. That could fuel some desire to enlist on your behalf in terms of your cause the most famous writer in England and during the Renaissance, and then one who writes beautifully about political conflicts and about religious issues and so on, to see him. And another thing to say about this is that the Anglican Protestant church in England at this time under Queen Elizabeth, her own tastes were really very high church, which means in many ways quite close to the Catholic service. The Anglican service was modeled on the Catholic service, just did away with certain what they regarded as superstitious elements that needed to be expunged and get back to that's what reform means, get back to the pure church as they regarded it, what the people in the...
Well, obviously, the religion was a hot topic in England where Shakespeare was writing. But when I consulted a digital concordance to try and look this up, I found over 1,000 references to God or an iteration of that to be found in Shakespeare's plays and sonnets. Why do you think he would have written so much about God?
Well, in this way, he's not different from anybody else. There was a strain around, if you looked for it, of agnosticism or skepticism about religion itself. But that was very dangerous stuff. And there were some of the people who espoused that were people who came, like Bruni, came from abroad and so on. And they could be burned at the stake for that. That was regarded as heretical. Well, it was from the point of view of the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church either. That was heresy of the most severe sort. And the thing to do with heretics all through this period was to execute them. It was also tied up with political endeavors to replace the Queen of England because she was a Protestant in the midst of what the Spaniards would have regarded as Catholic Europe. Before that, there was one church throughout Europe. It's actually a rather nice idea. The very word Catholic means all-embracing. There was the one church universal, which was the church going back to that of St. Paul and St. Peter and so on. And so they regarded the Protestant break-off as heresy and politically and religiously dangerous from their point of view.
With all of this risk of literally being burned at the stake or being beheaded for essentially a turn of phrase, how do you think this state of religion in England during his lifetime impacted Shakespeare's performances and the plays that he wrote?
Yes, especially we can see this. We don't know how he would have, he was an actor, by the way, but we don't really know very much about what roles he took or how he felt about this as an actor. But in terms of his writings, that the issue of religious faith often becomes very, very important, especially expressing a love of God and seeing that as very important to human salvation and human happiness. There actually, a case can be made, I'm interested in myself, in his later years, the big tragedies like King Lear, that one especially, that Shakespeare seems to have become quite fascinated with the thought that maybe, what are we to do if, in fact, all this talk about God and so on is a mythology, and it's a beautiful one, and it's sponsored a lot of very beautiful art and so on. But if it's all a fiction, if the gods aren't up there, because you look at things and you can say, well, I prayed and then nothing happened. Right?
Exactly. It causes some doubt.
Right. So that approach to skepticism is always there. And I think Shakespeare was troubled in King Lear. It's a play in which the chief villain, Edmund, is persuaded that his father has these superstitious ideas about how the gods control human destiny and so on. And Edmund is a skeptic who says, I think that's just a lot of eyewash, and I don't believe it's true. And what's more, since they are the gods who are purported to say we must behave, we're going to be damned if we don't. We'd be sent to hell if we're not decent to our fellow human beings and so on. I think that's just a lot of eyewash. And so I'm going to go ahead and act as though that is a mythology which I can disobey and ignore. And then I'm going to have the advantage over people who are attached to religion, because from his point, their superstitious notion that somehow the gods control human destiny means that they're held in. They won't murder or attack their fellow human beings and so on to try to get in. But I can do that because I don't think that's anything in back of that.
Because I don't buy it. Yeah.
The play ultimately sees that there's something wrong with that, but the play does really confront the issue. What would happen to us if it's all very beautiful story, but if it's only a beautiful story, could we get away with just ignoring all that and become thoroughgoing Machiavellian villains and so on? Edmund comes within an ace of becoming the King of England under these circumstances in the play of King Lear. So I find that very fascinating, that Shakespeare just wanted to see, at least in his breadth of mind and his fascination with these are important questions. I mean, if you really take religion seriously and organize religion seriously with the creeds of that Christ, the Christian creed that God was born, he ascended in heaven, and so on. That if that's all open to question and may turn out to be poetry, then that takes a hugely different approach to the question of what obligates us to behave and to be kindly and generous and compassionate with other people and so on. And what where do we go from there if all that stuff isn't true?
Exactly. Well, tangentially related to that idea of the mindset and how that impacts not only how you're asking the questions, but what you do with the answers. In Shakespeare's Richard II, John of Gaunt calls King Richard God's substitute.
Yes.
And being willing to let King Richard get away with murder on the grounds that the king was God's deputy. And the idea that the reigning monarch was a stand-in for God himself, I've read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, this is of course true.
Popular idea. And I wonder, when Shakespeare was under the patronage of King James, how do you think this perspective that the monarch was a stand-in for God impacted what Shakespeare wrote, or even what he left out of the plays that he performed?
Right. Well, you're on to a wonderful question there. Exactly. One thing to say to go back to the play Richard II, which is written under Elizabeth about 6 or 7 years before King James came to the throne. But it's not Shakespeare who's saying that. It is one of his major characters in the play, right? The John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and who's the father of Henry V, the one who becomes Henry IV, I'm sorry. And then we have Henry V after that. That was this doctrine of the king as being a deputy of God, of course, was something that we can say from an analytical point of view is obviously something that the Tudor monarchs had every reason to promote as an ideology because it supported their claim, a very strong claim, being strong that God thinks that a king is his first deputy on earth. There's every reason to be very obedient to him, and lots of justification on his part if he wants to kill people he considers heretics. And that opens a pretty wide door in what a king the kind of power that a king can exercise. And on Henry VIII, that had been demonstrated with rather severe results and so on. That he killed a lot of his wives, but it went much further than that. And so on. And under Queen Mary during mid-century, Protestants were being burned at the stake, including bishops and archbishops and so on, outside the walls of Oxford and all throughout of England. So we can see, my point here is that Shakespeare himself, where is Shakespeare in all of this? He certainly allows this idea of divine right of kings to be expressed in the wonderfully eloquent language of which he is such a master, that they speak so beautifully and it's so convincing. The metaphors are just extraordinary. But then he also has other characters who are more skeptical. Indeed, in that play of Richard II, the person who then becomes Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, he's not one. I wouldn't want to argue that he comes through as a skeptic, but he doesn't. And certainly once he becomes the king and has the throne, he's really very glad to allow this mythology of the king being God's deputy on earth. He's glad to use that same idea and so on to reinforce his control once it is his chance to be able to do that. Since he does in that play, he becomes the agent for disinheriting Richard II to the throne and then ultimately having him executed and in prison and so on, that he's obviously willing to take the chance that it's because Richard II, to his very end, talks about is the king's deputy, God's deputy on earth. So that the play sees that as a subject for a dramatic conflict, which of course is the stuff of drama.
Right. It's the point, yeah.
And it works beautifully for Shakespeare that way. Now, to say all that is not to suggest that he doesn't believe any of this, but he sees it as a complicated question on which people, if you study history and so on, or example, people in your plays and so on, they're torn apart by this very question.
Which it is complicated, really, because some of the history of this time period, particularly under Elizabeth, it reads as if Catholics were treated like religious terrorists. But you mentioned earlier it was the Protestants who really were the rebels and went off and started their own thing. So
both sides were quite prepared to burn at the stake. People,
right? It was very, very tense.
That's right. And then the very welfare of the English throne hangs in the balance throughout this whole period. When Elizabeth came to the throne, and shortly before Shakespeare was born, in the middle of the 16th century, England didn't know, nobody knew from one moment to the next whether Elizabeth would be able to inherit that. She was Protestant because she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who was Henry Henry VIII's second wife. The Catholics took a view that this was an illegal marriage, that there was even an adulterous relationship, that Henry VIII got rid of his wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he could. Now, the Pope had to be called in on that question, and of course the Pope said, no, of course Henry cannot divorce his wife and marry some other woman. So the whole domestic issue of legitimacy becomes caught up in this same topic.
You've definitely helped me see the dynamic of, studying the history of the time period and studying Shakespeare's plays.
And why it would matter so much, right?
They really influence each other.
Yeah.
You can't really study one without the other and have a complete picture. So, well, you've studied so much of Shakespeare's life. I wonder if anyone has ever asked you a question that surprised you.
Well, one thing I want to say about that makes it wonderful subject to teach. Not only is the poetry magnificent and the speeches so beautiful, and also his plays, they're so extraordinarily well constructed as plays. But if the feelings are that high, and if the issues at stake are so crucial to human happiness and so on. That really raises the temperature of these plays in the sense of the emotional, not only emotional, but the intellectual and spiritual importance of the issues that are at stake. Right. So then you wanted to ask about whether something surprised me in the plays as we come along. Was that the question? Right.
You've studied Shakespeare so much. Has anyone ever asked you a question that surprised you?
I guess more recently, I mean, the last 34 years, I've been surprised that there are a number of people who are so attached to the notion of Shakespeare as a Catholic. But I'm going back a little bit too, there is the issue of whether Shakespeare, in fact, was written by somebody else. There are a number of people that have been, this is mainly since the middle of the 19th century, was proposed first, in fact, by an American who regarded herself as a descendant of Sir Francis Bacon. Her name was Lydia Bacon. Perhaps Sir Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays. Well, that became quite a hot issue. If he's such a wonderful author, then if it turns out that really they're written by somebody else, that has at least to me and a lot of people who are skeptical about that, smells like conspiracy theory. It's a very attractive, if as a scholar or a researcher, you can find out that Shakespeare, had all these centuries. Right?
Yeah. That would be the
I'm now going to reveal
the
truth of the matter, which is that Shakespeare was actually, now one thing that this theory is a little bit thin, to say the least, from my point of view, is that Bacon was only the first, but there have been quite a number of other candidates. It's not Shakespeare who was it. Now, Christopher Marlowe has been proposed, but the most recent and still prevailing theory of the so-called anti-Stratfordians is it's the Earl of Oxford. In Queen Elizabeth's time, there was a troublesome courtier and so on. They were real struggles back and forth. And he did become a Catholic for a time, but he wrote some poetry. We have some samples of sonnets, which are quite capable. There was something a gentleman were supposed to learn how to do, and sort of with your left hand sort of toss up a sonnet as your cultural finesse and whatnot. But I think it's an impossible case to make that Shakespeare, the whole body of work could have been written by the Earl of Oxford. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I think I can say that essentially people who belong to the Shakespeare establishment, and I mean that in the broadest sense, the people who teach Shakespeare in colleges or junior colleges and so on all over the country and so on, there's hardly anybody in that whole group would take the view that Shakespeare was actually written by somebody else. But that came across as a great surprise to me that is particularly how people, and it includes people like Mark Twain, for example, he was fond of saying that the plays of Shakespeare were written not by Shakespeare, but by another person with the same name. and he had a kind of wit for that sort of thing. But below the joking, he found that attractive, partly because this was another establishment figure. Shakespeare was being used at the time to have English culture prevail in America, especially out in the frontiers and so on. You get this in Huckleberry Finn, a wonderful novel.
As we conclude, I guess, here today's conversation, I have 3 questions that are not directly related to Shakespeare. The first one being about books that you've read. And I was wondering if you had 1 or 2 titles that immediately came to mind as having the biggest impact on you.
Do you mean in terms of Shakespeare studies or more broadly?
More broadly, just books that have had an impact on you. It can be Shakespeare or anything that you...
Well, for that, I mean, Shakespeare himself, of course, is the biggest thing. But I tend to, I think, for example, War and Peace or Anna Karenina of Tolstoy, or Perfect Victorine of Madame Bovary, and in England, plays like Middlemarch by George Eliot, the novels of Jane Austen. That's a fair number, but all of those are the same. But I'd be happy to settle with any one of those as ones that really has turned my life around in terms of just being so extraordinary. They share with Shakespeare that same breadth of being able to see into the human condition and to see marriage, love, political failure, self-doubt, the fear of death, all the issues that are so profoundly meaningful to us as human beings and so on. Those people explore these things with this extraordinary depth and perception and finesse in a way that enable us to see something better about ourselves.
It's truly important to take part in and to read. I wonder if you have a favorite. Do you have a favorite book?
Well, that's very hard. It's probably the one I'm reading at the moment. At the moment I'm rereading Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. I wouldn't want to put that Well, Emma, I can't think of a better book than Emma, I guess, if I had to settle for one. If I were going to be sent off to jail and be able to take one book with me, that would be enough.
That would be the one. Wow, that's interesting. Well, for someone that wants to learn the plays of William Shakespeare and the life of the man himself, what is the one most important thing that you recommend they do?
It's a good idea to start with one of the plays that's more popularly accessible, like Romeo and Juliet. It's not a surprise that gets taught a lot in high school, or that indeed there have been many wonderful films produced about it. Hamlet is another. You could answer this question by looking at which of them have turned out the most largest number and the best films, and probably Hamlet does really rack up the highest points along that scale. There have been some perfectly magnificent productions of Hamlet because the directors come to this and they think, what is this? There's a nice story about that, about J. Arthur Rank, because he produced Laurence Olivier's Hamlet back in the middle of the 20th century, when that was a big question. There weren't very many films of Shakespeare. Would all popular audiences go to see films by Shakespeare and so on? And Rank agreed to do this, so that it was being filmed in studios and so on. And he asked one of his subalterns to go and see how it was going, because is this going to be a film we'll be able to sell and so on. And the chap went over and sat around and saw some rehearsal and so on. He came back and said, "Mr. Rank, don't worry, not to worry at all." Said, "You'd never know it was Shakespeare."
Well, there's an endorsement for you. So, well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm pretty much retired from trying to write longer studies. I'm involved in a number of articles. I love doing that. I've just been working on a piece that's called "Rivers in Shakespeare." Where did rivers turn up, and what do they mean to him, and so on. There's a good example we've been talking about Richard II. The next play, Henry IV, Part 1, is one in which some rebels conspire to and get together to challenge King Henry on the field of battle in Shrewsbury, which is in northern England. Well, it turns out Shrewsbury is that's the spot where that battle occurred, where the three rivers begin in the mountains of Wales, basically, and flow eastward. The Trent flows eastward into the northern Atlantic. The Severn flows down into the Bristol Channel, and then there's the Wye River, which also goes down the Bristol Channel. Those are the rivers of the way that England is divided into three.
Oh. And
that's what the rebels decide they're going to do. They're going to, one of them will have the south of England, which is around London and so on. And then the Percy, who is the northern lord, he's going to be up towards Scotland and indeed the whole north of England and so on. And then Glendower is and his allies are over in Wales. Well, that's pretty much the way England is configured, time out of mind historically. It's very much the same. You get the same thing in King Lear,
the three daughters.
The three daughters, and it turns out that those three daughters represent these three portions of England, the timeless sort of anxiety of England about the disillusionment to different parts of the country. So I've been studying what rivers mean to Shakespeare. This is one instance where the rivers seem to indicate that whole.
And it all ties back to the rivers.
Right.
Well, that's fascinating. I know that we will be looking forward to reading your articles in the future. And Dr. David Bevington, it's been truly delightful to speak with you today. I appreciate you being a guest with us on the podcast.
I'm honored. Thank you so much. Wonderful to talk. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.